Heifer Development, Lesson 3, Weaning and Selection. Select at least 20% in excess at weaning and continue growing heifers until breeding. A second selection may well occur at the yearling age. Use a relatively short breeding season and preg check and sell the open ones. Final selection is after the first calf is weaned. Early growth, weaning, and yearling weight and frame. Traditional selection is pick the big ones. Well, you normally get the older ones that way. You may or may not select for more milk, and the older they are, the more likely they are to breed. However, be cautious with that. The heaviest heifers may be fat. Fat in the udder affects lifetime milk production, or is an endocrine imbalance, and that's why they're so big. And they may well be subfertile. Problems with that traditional selection: if the heifers are fat, just mentioned it, you don't want them, you may have fat deposits in that udder area that's going to affect future milk production. The endocrine imbalance could result in subfertile at breeding. And the biggest problem is frame creep. So keeping the big ones, you might expect your cattle may be getting taller too. Frame creep, the gradual increase in cow size over time, and may put demands on your nutritional resources and may begin seeing difficulty in maintaining cow condition. So also, it is tempting to keep those heifers from a terminal sire breeding program. Selecting for larger actual weight will generally result in a more uniform group capable of reaching pubertal weight at about the same time. As long as sires and grandsires are not too big, should not be a problem. Be cautious of what we call the framey heifer, real tall, with below average body condition. There is a relationship between frame score and hip height on estimated mature cow weight. I've highlighted hip height at 12 months of age, or as yearlings, and then you can look over to the far right to see that estimated mature cow weight. So this may be a time, certainly you can look at them at weaning or say at 7 months of age, but also at that yearling time, you might look at these hip heights. Weaning weight and yearling weight are moderately heritable. Heifers have a within herd weaning weight ratio below 90. The average, say, is 100. Maybe those animals should be culled in at least commercial cow herds. So, and these could be some of those heifers that were born late in the breeding season. Seldom should heifers with high adjusted weaning weights and low actual weaning weights be kept as replacements, most certainly in commercial cow herds. And that may be the result here of heavy milking cows that are late calvers. That may not be what you're seeking in the long term. At weaning, certainly you need the purebred herds have some criteria they need to look at. Use heifers' EPDs for weaning and yearling weight. If having trouble keeping the heaviest milking cows, the high milk EPDs in the early part of the calving season, you have to think about what impact that's having on your bull buyers as well. Well, selection as yearlings. Yearling weight can be more accurate and predictor of growth than potential than weaning weight. Weaning weight can be, you're seeing that impact of the dam on that calf. Yearling weight, you get a feel for how much of that weight is away after weaning. Also, I come back to, you may need to establish maximum frame scores at this time. Remember, I highlighted that earlier. You can maybe use a nail or some paint and put a line, and anything that's above that line, you probably expect some frame creep. So maybe they don't stay in the herd. And there's traits beyond growth. There's those maternal traits. Early puberty is highly heritable. We talked about scrotal circumference. With regards to fertility, use caution with cows that have a long postpartum interval, from time of calving to actually getting bred. Calving ease can affect postpartum interval. Now, admittedly, calving ease is certainly on the bull, but that long postpartum interval is important because that affects fertility. So you want calving ease. Milk production, just talked about that, that can affect fertility as well. Soundness is very important. So longevity, you're looking for that, and it's highly heritable. Temperament is very important, or at least the older I get, the more important it is. And overall cow efficiency, certainly need to track that. There is a temperament score by the Beef Improvement Federation that you could use to evaluate temperament at the squeeze chute. So 1 being very docile, 2 restless, all the way down to 5 and 6 aggressive and very aggressive. Keep in mind, this is heritable. Well, management for weaning. Well, the U.S. beef industry, like $44 billion, health problems due to transitioning calves from farm to feedlot, about $700 million. Therefore, we need to think about vaccinating our calves before they are stressed and reduce, eliminate, or at least spread the stress out versus making it all on one day. Well, a stressful time in life is at weaning. There's 6 letters to the word stress. Just like going to school, things cause stress. There's a new source of water, new source of feed, new pecking order. There's different pathogens, newly weaned from that cow. And maybe there's transport involved, and maybe a new environment. Some of the problems, reduced growth, sickness, and perhaps even death if we don't do the weaning management correctly. And this is just some survey data on percent of operations by most important factor at weaning. Admittedly, calf age and weight is one of those major reasons when they wean, when they do. There can be, as you see, some other ones, but calf weight and age is an important factor. General considerations: dehorning at least 3 weeks prior to weaning. Certainly, the Ohio Livestock Standards Boards recommends much earlier than that. Preferably, you don't want to do it at these later ages. Consider some parasite control. Cows, you can consider early weaning if it's needed. The parasite load, that comes back to parasite control. How the animals are handled at weaning is important. And the overall environment, that pen or the feed, and then your ability to identify sick calves. Dehorning, this is, once again, there's not a recommendation here, but you see when many people will dehorn. But earlier the better, can reduce that stress. Maybe you're doing it with a bull, fine, but if it is mechanical, you need to do it at an early age to minimize that stress. Handling should be like putting your kids on the bus the first day of school. Where you're going to do the weaning shouldn't be a confusing design. Try to avoid crowding and bruising. Minimize the yelling. Avoid, or at least minimize, the use of whips and hot shots. Successful weaning reduces stress. What strategy meets your goals? Well, we need to minimize, for the cattle, minimize them getting sick, dying, and we don't want those chronics. Whereas the producer has stress too, is there limited labor? There can be a mental stress and a financial stress. We need to evaluate all these on both sides. One of the ways is dry lot weaning. Feed bunks and water troughs are provided for the calves. This can produce the highest gains. It has an advantage of observation. You can spot those 6 calves relatively rapidly if you're doing it correctly. Some flexible marketing with these calves, although it involves the greatest labor and facility investment. And you can, if it's dusty, quite a bit of susceptibility to illness. So we need to think about maybe a pre-weaning vaccination program if we're looking at dry lot weaning. Admittedly, the facilities at least don't have to be fancy. They should be dry but not dusty, and the pen should be relatively shallow. Here we see about a 60-foot depth. Calves weaned into large pens will walk 10 miles the first 2 days after weaning. They're looking for the dam, and that can cause a lot of exhaustion and even respiratory disease. So you may put feed bunks right where they're walking, and that forces them to at least look at that feed and maybe consume something. Diet considerations have bunk exposure maybe prior to weaning, hay plus 5 to 10 pounds of grain perhaps, and then step up the grain over time. Maybe you don't start at 10 pounds, but you start targeting getting them up on grain, and then look, maybe you do this for 30 to 45 days, this weaning process. Bunk space, 1.5 to 2 feet per calf. You want clean, fresh water. You probably want to avoid finely ground feed. You don't want it dusty. Maybe cracked corn can work well. Do you creep for 2 weeks before weaning? That can be a consideration for some. And there you see a diagram, the cattle movement, and trying to put the feed, interrupting the movement, so maybe they'll stop and eat or drink. And the sort of feeds, we mentioned cracked corn. You probably want to stay away from the fast fermenting grains like wheat, barley, high moisture corn, steam flake corn. We're probably thinking about some dry roll corn or whole corn, some of the slower fermenting type feeds here. The weaning diet, about 14 to 16% crude protein, about 0.5 megacalories for net energy gain. Also, we talked about these other feeds, but actually some great feeds for weaning, even in creep feeding, are, I call them friendly fibers. Soybean hulls, corn gluten feed, and wheat midds, or some of those things, at least here in Ohio, we have, and they can be very valuable as part of a weaning diet. What about alternative weaning methods? Pasture weaning. Leave calves on familiar pasture and move the cows. What you can do is maybe you're going to move everybody, the herd, to a pasture that's going to be a weaning pasture. And you do that prior to the actual weaning for a few weeks so the calves get used to the area. Then you move the cows away. Now, there are 2 ways to do this. They can be move the cows so far away the calves can't hear them, or they're across the fence. This can be similar to a dry lot. Maybe it's 50% grain, but expecting the calf to have consume about 50% forage from the pasture, about maybe a 16% protein mix in that grain. Certainly incorporate vitamins and minerals. And there are commercial feed companies, excellent rations they put together in bags that you can look at for weaning. Also, pre-weaning, consider a pre-weaning vaccination program. We're trying to spread that stress out prior to the weaning period and during weaning period. Now, there's that fence line weaning. You just move the cows across from the calves. This makes sure there's some nice lush pasture for those calves to consume. You may need a 4-wire electric fence or non-electric with electric standoff wire to separate those calves from the cows. Now, we found for that early period that the cows will bawl, but after just a couple of days, the calves kind of settle down, and you can move those cows away, no problem. And you can grain supplement next to the fence if needed, similar to a dry lot situation. So here we were doing some work with pasture weaning. Some of the advantages of pasture weaning, it's in some ways low stress on the calf because they're in a familiar environment, low labor and facilities. Admittedly, a good fence is needed. We talked about 4 strands of electric or a standoff electric wire on conventional fence, and maybe some flexible marketing options. The disadvantages of pasture weaning, it can be more difficult to identify and treat 6 calves because they're out in pasture. The fencing requirements, just talked about that. And then perhaps even you don't want mature pasture with the headed out old fescue, because that will have more endophyte in it. This is a weaning supplement that we use with pasture weaning. There's nothing magical about it, but you too can do something similar. But I hasten to also mention there are commercial feed mixes that could well be used as well. And work with your veterinarian on a health program. Whatever you need. Also, consider deworming. I know research that I did with heifers, we found that we were able to tighten up the group as it is. Some of those had heavier loads, and the deworming made the heifers more uniform. Also, injections, certainly with beef quality assurance, we want those injections in the neck on all the calves. And I heard some people complain about lumps on the neck. That's a good thing. That shows the vaccine is working. The vaccine is turning on the immune system. The immune system with that lump there is telling you, hey, the immune system is working. It is responding. We don't want this injecting in the rump and certainly putting too much in there, and it's just being wasted.